Lab 257 by Michael C. Carroll. The Disturbing Story of the Government's Secret. Part 02. Outbreaks. 1975. The Lyme Connection. Dear Anne, have you ever heard of Lyme disease? I am writing this letter because I know you can help thousands of people by warning them about this awful sickness. I have been battling it for 18 months. Frankly, I am not doing well. It would be impossible for me to describe the emotional and physical pain that I have been through. I am a 42-year-old man, married nearly 20 years, and have a family. The days of slinging a 100-pound sack of birdseed over my shoulder and walking to the backyard are over. Today I can't even lift a 5-pound sack of flour. There was a time when I could play 9 musical instruments. I sang in the church choir and ran my own small business. Today, I do none of the above. I am saving all my energy to fight Lyme disease. The treatment costs are staggering. For antibiotic therapy runs from $150 to $475 a treatment. We have already taken out a third mortgage on our home. Had I been aware of the symptoms from the beginning, I could have had $15 worth of oral antibiotics and that would have done the job. Thank you, Anne, for allowing me to try to help others. SJN, Mattituck, New York. Protecting a nuclear power plant is no small task. When it opened in the 1980s, the Shoreham nuclear power plant on Long Island's North Shore boasted a 175-man militia equipped with Uzi 9mm, AR-15 assault rifles, and 12-gauge shotguns. This elite paramilitary unit patrolled the protected area, a dense forest hundreds of acres deep that buffered the controlled area, a huge concrete dome sheltering the uranium nuclear reactor. Every 8 hours, a fresh detachment of 50 men, armed to the teeth and clad in steel-toed boots, tan pants, and khaki shirts, marched in lockstep through the protected area along dirt paths and through marshes, their watchful eyes and ears continually scanning for intruders. One Shoreham security officer, a short, blonde-bearded, barrel-chested man, remembers the scene during the 3 o'clock p.m. to 11 o'clock p.m. shift in October 1987. His platoon had just moved out, marching into a field where they often spotted herds of 30 or 40 wild deer darting ahead of them into the wooded glen. He felt a brief pinch on his left ankle and thought it was the stiff new army boots he was breaking in. Later that night, he went home and showered. Pulling off his white tube socks, he noticed a small red mark on his ankle. Those damn boots, he thought, and went to bed. When he awoke the next morning, the nagging blister had grown, so he grabbed tweezers from the bathroom vanity and poked at the area. Suddenly, something started to move, and he realized it wasn't a blister at all. It was a live bug. Panicked, he frantically dug into it. As he extracted the critter, it broke in two, spilling its insides into the microscopic holes it punched into his body. 72 hours later, he thought he had caught the flu. Within a week, his joints began to ache. Most people don't think of deer as swimmers. But swim they do. Indigenous to most of the United States and Canada, white-tailed deer can swim distances as long as 4 miles. Their natural predators, wolf, bear, mountain lion, and coyote, are long extinct from the northeastern landscape, but one tiny foe remains. Poised atop a blade of grass, the deer tick waits patiently for anything warm-blooded to brush by, feeding on deer as well as smaller creatures like birds and mice. The tick jumps aboard and pierces its sharp mouth hooks into the skin of its unlucky host. A tiny glutton with a king-sized appetite, the tick sucks the blood of its host in a feast that can last up to 2 whole days, while it swells to a bubble over 3 times its original size. At the same time, the little parasite deposits its own fluids into the host, fluids that sometimes prove fatal. The feeding habits of ticks and the swimming abilities of deer were of little concern to the residents of Old Lyme, Connecticut, in July 1975. This quaint New England town is, for the most part, an upper-crust community with tree-lined streets and fine colonial and federal-style homes. As one of America's oldest towns, founded by English Puritans, Old Lyme was enjoying its tricentennial as the nation prepared for a bicentennial. But a strange set of occurrences that year would forever change its reputation from a warm, charming enclave to a place of fear and despair. Old Lyme, nestled on the banks of the Connecticut River, sits just a shade north of the Long Island Sound. The midsummer weather in 1975 was typical for coastal Connecticut, hot, sticky, and humid. As little ones frolicked in the sun, ignoring the blistering heat, and grown-ups sought refuge on their porches by night, grateful for a balmy summer breeze, Polly Murray and Judith Minch noticed something unusual about their children. Seemingly out of nowhere, they were showing signs of strange physical and mental ailments. Alarmed, the two mothers quickly phoned their neighbors, who were observing strikingly similar conditions in their own children. Many of the kids in the neighborhood, and some adults, were suffering from the same skin rashes, throbbing headaches, and painful swollen joints. Together, Polly and Judith brought their concerns to the Connecticut Department of Health, which immediately appointed physicians from Yale University to investigate. Initially, the doctors misdiagnosed 39 children and 12 adults with juvenile rheumatoid arthritis, a condition they named Lyme arthritis, after the town where the strange outbreak occurred. 2 years later, scientists linked Lyme arthritis to the bite of a deer tick. And in 1981, Dr. Wally Bergdorfer, a researcher at the National Institutes of Health, discovered a thin spiral bacteria, in technical terms, a spirochete, immersed in the fluid of a deer tick. He proved that the new spirochete was to blame, not for Lyme arthritis, but for an entirely new ailment, Lyme disease. Borrelia burgdorferi, BB, named in honor of its discoverer, attacks humans in a number of ways, which is one reason why it remains difficult to diagnose. Characterized by symptoms such as facial paralysis and stiff swelling in the neck and joints, BB also causes maladies like meningitis and encephalitis, both swellings of the brain, and cardiac problems, including atrioventricular block, myopercarditis, and cardiomegaly. Because BB attacks the body's central nervous system, additional symptoms of Lyme disease include acute headaches, general fatigue, fever, moodiness, and depression. That brief pinch the nuclear power plant trooper felt on his ankle that afternoon was the bite of an enemy no larger than the period at the end of this sentence. The chance of finding something that size, even had it attached to his exposed forearm, was pretty slim. The foe was either a 8-legged nymph deer tick or a lone star tick, swelling up to 100 times its size with his blood. And while it sipped away, the tick regurgitated hundreds of spiral-shaped BB bacteria into the victim's blood. The tick is the perfect germ vector, which is why it has long been fancied as a germ weapon by early bio-warriors from Nazi Germany and the Empire of Japan to the Soviet Union and the United States. Fixing its target by sensing exhaled carbon dioxide, the creature grabs onto a mammal's skin with its legs and digs in with its mouth hooks. The tick secretes saliva that helps glue it to its host, making it difficult to separate. A special hormone in the tick counteracts antibodies sent by the host to fight it off, and the crafty tick secretes an anti-inflammatory to prevent itching, so the host hardly knows it's there. If the tick is the perfect germ messenger, then BB is an incredibly clever germ. Because its outside wall is hard to destroy, the bacterium can fight off immune responses and antibiotic drugs. BB finds a home in the mouth and salivary glands of larvae and nymph ticks, and infects females' ovaries and the thousands of eggs they will lay after breeding while attached to deer, upon which BB has little effect. Common in mice and birds as well. Today there are 5 subspecies of BB and over 100 mutated substrains in the United States. The question that experts haven't been able to answer is why this disease suddenly surfaced in Old Lyme, Connecticut, in the summer of 1975. Project Paperclip meets Plum Island. I do not believe that we should offer any guarantees to protection in the post-hostilities period to Germans. Among them may be some who should properly be tried for war crimes or at least arrested for active participation in Nazi activities. President F. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, 1944. To the victors belong the spoils of the enemy. U.S. Senator William L. MRC, 1832. Dr. C. A. Mitchell began his remarks at the 1956 Plum Island Dedication Day by reminiscing on the late World War. I often think and almost tremble at what could have taken place had our Teutonic enemies been more alive to this. It is said that some of their scientists pointed out the advantages to be obtained from the artificial sowing of disease agents that attack domestic animals. Fortunately, blunders existed in the Teutonic camp as in our own. Consequently, this means of attack was looked upon as a scientific poppy dream. If, as much time and money were invested in biologic agent dispersion as in one bomber plane, the free world would have almost certainly gone down to defeat. The audience murmured an acknowledgement, but one Dedication Day VIP stirred uncomfortably, the director of the new virus laboratory in Tübingen, West Germany, personally invited by Plum Island director Maurice S. Doc Shahin. The mind of the brown-haired man with the scar on his face and upper lip held a dark secret. He sat there perspiring, staring at Dr. Mitchell through his gray-brown eyes, wondering how many people knew his past. For he, Dr. Eric Traub, was that Teutonic enemy. Strangely enough, he had every right to be there. He was one of Plum Island's founding fathers. Nearing the end of World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union raced to recruit German scientists for post-war purposes. Under a top-secret program code-named Project Paperclip, the U.S. military pursued Nazi scientific talent like forbidden fruit, bringing them to America under employment contracts and offering them full U.S. citizenship. The recruits were supposed to be nominal participants in Nazi activities. But the zealous military recruited more than 2,000 scientists, many of whom had dark Nazi party pasts. One American scientist viewed these Germans as peers, and quickly forgot they were on opposite sides of a ghastly global war in which millions perished. Fearing brutal retaliation from the Soviets for the Nazis' vicious treatment of them, some scientists cooperated with the Americans to earn amnesty. Others played the two nations off each other to get the best financial deal in exchange for their services. Dr. Eric Traub was trapped on the Soviet side of the Iron Curtain after the war, and ordered to research germ warfare viruses for the Russians. He pulled off a daring escape with his family to West Berlin in 1949. Applying for Project Paperclip employment, Traub affirmed he wanted to do scientific work in the USA, become an American citizen, and be protected from Russian reprisals. As lab chief of Insil Reims, a secret Nazi biological warfare laboratory on a crescent-shaped island nestled in the Baltic Sea, Traub worked directly for Adolf Hitler's second-in-charge, SS Reichsführer Heinrich Himmler, on live germ trials. He packaged weaponized foot-and-mouth disease virus, which was dispersed from Luftwaffe bomber onto cattle and reindeer in occupied Russia. At Himmler's request, Traub personally journeyed to the Black Sea coast of Turkey. There, amid the lush Anatolian terrain, he searched for a lethal strain of rinderpest virus for use against the Allies. Earlier in the war he had been a captain in the German army, working as an expert on infectious animal diseases, particularly in horses. His veterinary corps led the germ warfare attacks on horses in the United States and Romania in World War I with a bacteria called glanders. He was also a member of NSKK, the Nazi Motorists Corps, a powerful Nazi organization that ranked directly behind the SA, stormtroopers, and the SS, elite corps. In fact, NSKK's first member, joining in April 1930, was Adolf Hitler himself. Traub also listed his 1930s membership in Amerika Deutscher Volksbund, a German-American club also known as Camp Siegfried. Just 30 miles west of Plum Island in Yathang, Long Island, Camp Siegfried was the national headquarters of the American Nazi movement. Over 40,000 people throughout the New York region arrived by train, bus, and car to participate in Nuremberg-like rallies. Each weekend they marched in lockstep divisions, carrying swastika flags, burling Jewish U.S. congressmen in effigy, and singing anti-Semitic songs. Above all, they solemnly pledged their allegiance to Hitler and the Third Reich. Ironically, Traub spent the pre-war period of his scientific career on a fellowship at the Rockefeller Institute in Princeton, New Jersey, perfecting his skills in viruses and bacteria under the tutelage of American experts before returning to Nazi Germany on the eve of war. Despite Traub's troubling war record, the U.S. Navy recruited him for its scientific designs, and stationed him at the Naval Medical Research Institute in Bethesda, Maryland. Just months into his paperclip contract, the Germ warriors of Fort Detrick, the Army's biological warfare headquarters in Frederick, Maryland, and CIA operatives invited Traub in for a talk, later reported in a declassified top-secret summary. Dr. Traub is a noted authority on viruses and diseases in Germany and Europe. This interrogation revealed much information of value to the animal disease program from a biological warfare point of view. Dr. Traub discussed work done at a German animal disease station during World War II and subsequent to the war when the station was under Russian control. Traub's detailed explanation of the secret operation on Incel Reims, and his activities there during the war and for the Soviets, laid the groundwork for Fort Detrick's offshore germ warfare animal disease lab on Plum Island. Traub was a founding father. Little is publicly available about his clandestine activities for the U.S. military. The names of 2 studies, experiments with chick embryo-adapted foot and mouth disease and studies on in vitro multiplication of Newcastle disease virus in chicken blood, were made available under the Freedom of Information Act, but the research reports themselves, and many others, were withheld. With his laboratory assistant Ann Brigger, who came over in 1951, Traub experimented with over 40 lethal viruses on large test animals. Traub also spent time at the USDA laboratories in Beltsville, Maryland, where he isolated a new weapons-grade virus strain in the USDA lab. Studying a virulent strain of a new virus that caused human infections, Traub showed how it adapted neurotropically in humans by voraciously attacking nerve and brain tissues. This was the same potent virus that infected a human in Plum Island's first ever germ experiment 1 year later. By 1953, West Germany recognized a need for its own Incel Reims and built a high-containment virus facility in Tübingen. They asked Dr. Erich Traub to return to the fatherland and assume command. Permission was granted. But there was a catch. In view of Dr. Traub's eminence as an international authority and the recognizable military potentialities in the possible application of his specialty, it is recommended that future surveillance and appropriate measure be maintained after the specialist's return to Germany. In other words, the CIA would be tailing him for years. As soon as the lab opened for business, he turned to Plum Island for starter strains of viruses, which were gladly shipped over. USDA officials traveled to West Germany and visited his laboratory often. Erich Traub in Plum Island. Everybody seemed willing to forget about Erich Traub's dirty past, that he had played a crucial role in the Nazis' cancer research program, the cover name for their biological warfare program, and that he worked directly under SS Reichsführer Heinrich Himmler. They seemed willing to overlook that Traub in the 1930s faithfully attended Camp Siegfried. In fact, the USDA liked him so much, It glossed over his dubious past and offered him the top scientist job at the new Plum Island laboratory, not once, but twice. Just months after the 1952 public hearings on selecting Plum Island, Doc Shahin dialed Dr. Traub at the Naval Laboratory to discuss plans for establishing the germ laboratory and the position on Plum Island. 6 years later, and only 2 years after Traub squirmed at his seat at the Plum Island dedication ceremonies, senior scientist Dr. Jacob Traum retired. The USDA needed someone of outstanding caliber, with a long-established reputation, internationally as well as nationally, to fill Dr. Traum's shoes. But somehow it couldn't find a suitable American. As a last resort, it is now proposed that a foreigner be employed. The Aggies' choice? Eric Traub, who was in their view the most desirable candidate from any source. The 1958 secret USDA memorandum justification for employment of Dr. Eric Traub conveniently omitted his World War II activities, but it did emphasize that his originality, scientific abilities, and general competence as an investigator were developed at the Rockefeller Institute in New Jersey in the 1930s. The letters supporting Traub to lead Plum Island came in from fellow Plum Island founders. I hope that every effort will be made to get him. He has a long and productive experience in both pre-war and post-war Germany, said Dr. William Hagen, Dean of the Cornell University Veterinary School, carefully dispensing with his wartime activities. The final word came from his dear American friend and old Rockefeller Institute boss Dr. Richard Shope, who described Traub as careful, skillful, productive, and very original and one of this world's most outstanding virologists. Shope's sole reference to Traub at war: during the war he was in Germany serving in the German army. Declining the USDA's offer, Traub continued his directorship of the Tübingen Laboratory in West Germany, though he visited Plum Island frequently. In 1960, he was forced to resign as Tübingen's director under a dark cloud of financial embezzlement. Traub continued sporadic lab research for another 3 years, and then left Tübingen for good, a scandalous end to a checkered career. In the late 1970s, the esteemed virologist Dr. Robert Shope, on business in Munich, paid his father Richard's old Rockefeller Institute disciple a visit. The germ warrior had been in early retirement for about a decade by then. I had dinner with Traub one day, out of old time's sake, and he was a pretty defeated man by then. On May 18, 1985, the Nazis' virus warrior Dr. Eric Traub died unexpectedly in his sleep in West Germany. He was 78 years old. A biological warfare mercenary who worked under 3 flags, Nazi Germany, the Soviet Union, and the United States, Traub was never investigated for war crimes. He escaped an inquiry into his wartime past. The full extent of his sordid endeavors went with him to his grave. While America brought a handful of Nazi war criminals to justice, it safeguarded many others in exchange for verses to the new state religion, modern science and espionage. Records detailing a fraction of Eric Traub's activities are now available to the public, but most are withheld by Army intelligence and the CIA on grounds of national security. But there's enough of a glimpse to draw quite a sketch. I began to feel like a man made out of glass, like someone hit me with a baseball bat and shattered me from the top of my head to the balls of my feet, the nuclear power plant guard recalls. Never in my life had I experienced such pain. His hands gnarled into contortions, and his vocal cords weakened and then became paralyzed, rendering him mute. The left side of his body went numb. A rheumatologist misdiagnosed him, just like doctors misdiagnosed the children of old Lyme, Connecticut, in 1975, with rheumatoid arthritis. Then, the neurological symptoms set in. He experienced violent mood swings where he would be calm one moment and bawling silly the next. A newfound sensitivity to light made him a prisoner in his home, with the shades drawn and lights turned off. Noise was magnified 100-fold, to the point that the vibrations from a person walking across the floor were excruciating. His incessant reflexive coughing was so powerful, it broke 3 of his ribs and brought out large globs of blood. When he told the doctor he suspected he had a long misunderstood ailment, Lyme disease, the doctor laughed. But with the help of his wife, a registered nurse, he diagnosed himself with 38 of the 40 symptoms of Lyme. Results showed he had some of the highest known titers of the Rallya-Bergdorferi, BB, known in New York State. He was ordered to a hospital bed for intensive intravenous antibiotic treatment. The treatments for Lyme disease, which can range from oral antibiotics to massive weekly 4 infusions, are like trying to put out a forest fire with a watering can, according to another sufferer. The symptoms subsided 6 months after the tick bite, but came back with new fury 5 months later. More 4 antibiotics were prescribed. I remember sitting in my doctor's office and saying, "Doc, you know, I think I'm losing my mind." His heart, trying to cope with the large doses of chemicals, was failing him, but he figured he had nothing more to lose. He was dying. Teetering on the edge, the security guard mustered up what little strength he had left for one last hope. A deeply religious man, active in his church as a lay minister for some 25 years, he turned to a higher power. I could no longer speak. As the joint pain became unbearable, this one finger hurt so much I wanted it amputated, and I asked the doctor to amputate it. I prayed to God, "How do you expect me to preach when I can't speak?" And he said, "You have a typewriter, type." And I had one crummy finger left that I could move. It was the little finger on my left hand, and I'm right-handed. He began to pinky type, letter by letter, click clack click, whatever came to mind. In the very first sentence he punched the I key too hard and it broke off and fell on the floor. 40 years old, and I began to cry like a baby, and no sound came out. He finished the letter, carefully penciling in the I's. It was the most humble letter I have ever written in my life. He did not think anyone would even read the pathetic-looking half-typed, half-scrawled epistle. But plucking Stephen J. Nostrom's letter out of the thousands she received each day, the nationally syndicated advice columnist Ann Landers not only read it, she printed it. What happened next was completely unexpected. Nostrom received hundreds of phone calls and thousands of letters from Lyme disease sufferers and their family members who shared his pain. People were actually calling up telephone operators to get the exchange format to talk, randomly dialing numbers beginning with 298 and asking, "Is there a man in your town with the initials SJN who's involved with Lyme disease?" Buoyed by the overwhelming response, he began to heal himself by helping others. He set up a makeshift command center in the basement of his home. Nostrom started one of the nation's first Lyme disease support groups. Guests from around the country came to his monthly gatherings at the local library. Through his organization, the Lyme Borrelia Outreach Foundation, Lyme Borrelia is the technical name of Lyme disease, he published a newsletter, sent out audio tapes, distributed literature, and hosted a monthly cable television program seen across the country. He spoke at civic associations, churches, and schools, and testified before a special U.S. Senate Committee on Lyme disease. I've been involved in Christian ministry for 37 years, and I'm not going to tell you I saw a burning bush, says Nostrom. But I can look you square in the eye and tell you I felt a real calling to get the information out, no political agendas, strictly from a point of education and prevention. Nostrom's education would lead him into some surprising territory. Attorney John Loftus was hired in 1979 by the Office of Special Investigations, a unit set up by the Justice Department to expose Nazi war crimes and unearth Nazis hiding in the United States. Given top-secret clearance to review files that had been sealed for 35 years, Loftus found a treasure trove of information on America's post-war Nazi recruiting. In 1982, publicly challenging the government's complacency with the wrongdoing, He told 60 Minutes that top Nazi officers had been protected and harbored in America by the CIA and the State Department. They got the Emmy Award, Loftus wrote. My family got the death threats. Old spies reached out to him after the publication of his book, The Belarus Secret, encouraged that he, unlike other authors, submitted his manuscript to the government, agreeing to censor portions to protect national security. The spooks gave him copies of secret documents and told him stories of clandestine operations. From these leads, Loftus ferreted out the dubious Nazi past of Austrian President and UN Secretary-General Kurt Waldheim. Loftus revealed that during World War II, Waldheim had been an officer in a German army unit that committed atrocities in Yugoslavia. A disgraced Kurt Waldheim faded from the international scene soon thereafter. In the preface of The Belarus Secret, Loftus laid out a striking piece of information gleaned from his spy network. Even more disturbing are the records of the Nazi germ warfare scientists who came to America. They experimented with poison ticks dropped from planes to spread rare diseases. I have received some information suggesting that the U.S. tested some of these poison ticks on the Plum Island artillery range off the coast of Connecticut during the early 1950s. Most of the germ warfare records have been shredded, but there is a top-secret U.S. document confirming that clandestine attacks on crops and animals took place at this time. Erich Traub had been working for the American biological warfare program from his 1949 Soviet escape until 1953. We know he consulted with Fort Detrick scientists and CIA operatives, that he worked for the USDA for a brief stint, and that he spoke regularly with Plum Island director Doc Shahin in 1952. Traub can be physically placed on Plum Island at least 3 times. On Dedication Day in 1956 and 2 visits, once in 1957 and again in the spring of 1958. Shahin, who enforced an ultra-strict policy against outside visitors, each time received special clearance from the State Department to allow Traub on Plum Island soil. Research unearthed 3 USDA files from the vault of the National Archives, 2 were labeled Tick Research and a third E. Traub. All 3 folders were empty. The caked on dust confirms the file boxes hadn't been opened since the moment before they were taped shut in the 1950s. Preposterous as it sounds, clandestine outdoor germ warfare trials were almost routine during this period. In 1952, the Joint Chiefs of Staff called for a vigorous, well-planned, large-scale, biological warfare test program, with all interested agencies participating. A top-secret letter to the Secretary of Defense later that year stated, steps should be taken to make certain adequate facilities are available, including those at Fort Detrick, Dugway Proving Ground, Fort Terry, Plum Island, and an island field testing area. Was Plum Island the island field testing area? Indeed. When the Army first scouted Plum Island for its Cold War designs, they charted wind speeds and direction and found that, much to their liking, the prevailing winds blew out to sea. One of the participating interested agencies was the USDA, which admittedly set up large plots of land throughout the Midwest for airborne anti-crop germ spray tests. Fort Detrick's Special Operations Division ran vulnerability tests in which operatives walked around Washington, D.C., and San Francisco with suitcases holding Serratia marcescens, a bacteria recommended to Fort Detrick by Traub's nominal supervisor, Nazi germ czar and Nuremberg defendant Dr. Kurt Blome. Tiny perforations allowed the germs release so they could trace the flow of the germs through airports and bus terminals. Shortly thereafter, 11 elderly men and women checked into hospitals with never-before-seen Serratia marcescens infections. One patient died. Decades later when the germ tests were disclosed, the Army denied responsibility. A Department of Defense report later admitted the germ was an opportunistic pathogen, causing infections of the endocardium, blood, wounds, and urinary and respiratory tracts. In the summer of 1966, Special operations men walked into 3 New York City subway stations and tossed light bulbs filled with Bacillus subtilis, a benign bacteria, onto the tracks. The subway trains pushed the germs through the entire system and theoretically killed over 1 million passengers. Tests were also run with live, virulent, anti-animal germ agents. 2 hog collar bombs were exploded at an altitude of 1,500 feet over pig pens set up at Eglin Air Force Base in Florida. And turkey feathers laced with Newcastle disease virus were dropped on animals grazing on a University of Wisconsin farm. 6. The Army never fully withdrew its germ warfare efforts against food animals. 2 years after the Army gave Plum Island to the USDA and 3 years after it told President Eisenhower it had ended all biological warfare against food animals, the Joint Chiefs advised that research on anti-animal agent munition combinations should continue, as well as field testing of anti-food agent munition combinations. In November 1957, military intelligence examined the elimination of the food supply of the Sino-Soviet bloc, right down to the calories required for victory. In order to have a crippling effect on the economy of the USSR, the food and animal crop resources of the USSR would have to be damaged within a single growing season to the extent necessary to reduce the present average daily caloric intake from 2,800 calories to 1,400 calories, that is, the starvation level. Reduction of food resources to this level, if maintained for 12 months, would produce 20% fatalities, and would decrease manual labor performance by 95% and clerical and light labor performance by 80%. At least 6 outdoor stockyard tests occurred in 1964–65. Simulants were sprayed into stockyards in Fort Worth, Kansas City, St. Paul, Sioux Falls, and Omaha in tests determining how much foot and mouth disease virus would be required to destroy the food supply. Had the Army commandeered Plum Island for an outdoor trial? Maybe the USDA lent a hand with the trial, as it had done out west by furnishing the large test fields. After all, the Plum Island Agreement between the Army and the USDA allowed the Army to borrow the island from the USDA when necessary and in the national interest. Traub might have monitored the tests. A source who worked on Plum Island in the 1950s recalls that animal handlers and a scientist released ticks outdoors on the island. They called him the Nazi scientist. When they came in 1951, they were inoculating these ticks, and a picture he once saw shows the animal handler pointing to the area on Plum where they released the ticks. Dr. Traub's World War II handiwork consisted of aerial virus sprays developed on Insul reams and tested over occupied Russia, and of field work for Heinrich Himmler in Turkey. Indeed, his colleagues conducted bug trials by dropping live beetles from planes. An outdoor tick trial would have been de rigueur for Eric Traub. Somebody gave Steve Nostrom a copy of John Loftus's The Belarus Secret at one of his support group meetings. Steve had long suspected that Plum Island played a role in the evolution of Lyme disease, given the nature of its business and its proximity to old Lyme, Connecticut. But he never publicly voiced the hunch, fearing a loss of credibility. Hard facts and statistics earned him a reputation as a leader in the Lyme disease field. Now, in his hands, he had a book written by a Justice Department attorney who not only had appeared on 60 Minutes but also had brought down the Secretary General of the United Nations. Nostrom disclosed the possible Lyme connection on his own television show. He invited local news reporter and Plum Island ombudsman Carl Grossman to help him explore the possibilities in light of the island's biological mishaps. Asked why he wrote about Loftus's book in his weekly newspaper column, Grossman says, "To let the theory rise or fall. To let the public consider it. And it seemed to me that the author was a Nazi hunter and a reputable attorney. This was not trivial information provided by some unreliable person." In October 1995, Nostrom, fresh off nursing duty, having earned an RN degree to help Lyme disease patients, rushed to a rare public meeting held by the USDA. In a white nurse's coat, stethoscope still around his neck, nostrum rouse. Trembling, his blonde beard now streaked with gray, he clutched his copy of the Belarus Secret as he read the damning passage out loud for the USDA and the public to hear. "I don't know whether this is true," he said, looking at the dais. "If it is true, there must be an investigation. If it's not true, then John Loftus needs to be prosecuted." People in the audience clapped, and some were astonished. A few gawked, thinking he was nuts. How did the USDA officials react? "If stares could kill, I would have been dead," remembers Nostrum. Hiding behind the same aloof veil of secrecy they had employed for decades, the USDA brazenly cut him off. "There are those who think that little green men are hiding out there," the officials responded to Nostrum. "But trust us when we say there are no space aliens and no five-legged cows." A few laughs erupted in the crowd. "It did nothing but detract from what I was saying," says Nostrum. "But I said it, and I had the documentation to support it." Lab 257 by Michael C. Carroll. The Disturbing Story of the Government's Secret. End Part 02.